I remember the exact moment the HOA brigade stormed across the county line and onto my property, pitch folders clutched in sweaty palms, glossy shoes sinking in soft dirt, and eyes brimming with the confidence that they had the authority to boss around anyone with a front lawn. My front lawn, you ask? Not exactly. I live on a 60-acre farm that's been in my family for generations. Lawn doesn't quite describe all that open land. Yet to them, I was just another homeowner who needed a little guidance about neighborhood regulations. It would have been funny if they hadn't shown up looking like a team of lawyers on a warpath, wagging official-looking letters in my face. At first, I thought I'd misheard. They said something about how the new Master Creek Estates HOA has earmarked your land for future parking expansion. My farmland? A parking lot? The nerve. I was so stunned that my mouth didn't form words right away. Instead, I found myself staring blankly at the squat man in the ill-fitting suit who spoke like he was reading from a legal script. A few other officials behind him nodded in solemn agreement, as if turning my cow pasture into a parking area was the most logical solution on earth. The short man, apparently the head of the new development's HOA, introduced himself as Richard March. He offered me a typed letter explaining how Master Creek Estates had reserved the right to designate nearby public land as a potential community parking resource. My father's farmland wasn't public. It was ours, privately owned for over a century. But Richard insisted that public was more a matter of necessity than legal ownership. The gall. I tried to keep calm. I truly did. Look, I said, doing my best to remain polite. This land has been in my family since 1889. I'm not sure where you folks got the idea that you can just waltz in here and treat it like an empty mall parking lot. Richard gave me a look that suggested he believed I was the unreasonable one. According to the county's updated zoning map, he said slowly, as if speaking to a not-too-bright child, there's no strict residential or commercial demarcation on this perimeter. It's ambiguous. We, as the Homeowners Association, simply want to ensure that we're utilizing all possible resources for the collective good. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing in disbelief. The collective good of a new neighborhood. Maybe not for me. He waved his hands around, as if presenting a brand new invention. You realize how popular Master Creek Estates is going to be, right? The community amenities, the craft shops, the bistro. This neighborhood will draw visitors from miles around. We need parking, and your farmland is ideally situated. I took a deep breath, scanning the horizon of rolling fields and aging fences. This land had been my family's lifeblood. We grew everything from corn and soybeans to the occasional orchard fruits. My father hammered the fences by hand. My mother made sure the fields were properly irrigated. I'd grown up chasing sunrise chores with blistered hands and a sense of unshakable pride. And they wanted me to pave it over so their guests had a place to leave their SUVs for Saturday yoga class. I told them in no uncertain terms, you have no claim on my land. None. Richard's expression remained smug, but there was a slight twitch in his eye that hinted he wasn't used to direct defiance. His entourage, 3 or 4 people clutching clipboards, fidgeted uncomfortably. Perhaps they sensed this was not going how they'd hoped. Well, Richard said, clearing his throat, we've already submitted proposals to the county. If you aren't cooperative, the HOA may need to take alternative action. We can't be obstructed. I narrow my eyes. Obstructed from what, exactly? Trespassing. He gave a dismissive shrug and adjusted his tie. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement, he said. We'll be in touch. Without further explanation, he and his entourage turned and walked back toward their cars, slipping and sliding on the muddy path that led back to the main road. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding in my chest, a swirl of anger and disbelief coursing through me. Had this man essentially threatened to seize my family's farmland for a parking lot? This was a line I never expected anyone to cross. It almost felt like I was in a bad dream, where some random authority figure shows up and tries to take your home because they can't imagine how you could possibly resist them. Then I remembered something that made me chuckle under my breath. The farmland was connected to a decades-old transformer shed that housed the main electrical feed for the entire area, including the brand-new Master Creek Estates development. My parents had fought to keep that small substation on our property, and years ago, the local power company had come to a handshake agreement with us. Now, as Master Creek Estates needed a stable power source, they had to connect through that ancient substation. If the HOA insisted on messing with me, they should know who literally holds a switch. My father used to say, "Never pick a fight with the one who can pull your plug." The old man was wise, and I never quite understood the gravity of his advice until that day. I try not to let my blood boil too long. Instead, I calmly walked over to the substation. The front door still had the heavy padlock I'd replaced last summer. Sure enough, the hum of electricity inside was constant, fueling half the county in that brand new neighborhood. I tapped on the steel casing lightly, thinking to myself, if Richard March wants to wage war, he's about to discover that I'm not just some backward farmer who doesn't know his rights. I have leverage, too. No one had ever tried to declare my family farm as public anything, let alone a parking lot. But there's a first time for everything, I suppose. And if the HOA believed they could twist the county's arm, or mine, they needed to be prepared for a mighty pushback. I trudged back to my old farmhouse, the wooden porch creaking underfoot. The sun was setting behind the orchard, leaving streaks of gold across the fields. Despite my frustration, I felt an odd sense of resolve. They'd messed with the wrong farmer. 2 weeks passed before I heard from the HOA again, but they'd been busy. In that time, I noticed curious folks driving by my property at odd hours, snapping photos from their car windows. They never approached the house, but they'd slowed down to a crawl near the fields, sometimes craning their necks as though searching for vantage points. It was creepy, like being watched by a swarm of paparazzi. Except I'm no celebrity. I'm just a guy who refuses to let his farmland become a giant slab of concrete. Then came the letters. Copious letters. Each one arrived stamped with a Master Creek Estates HOA emblem. The gist was the same. We believe your property meets certain criteria for public land usage under the updated zoning code. Please cooperate. They had the nerve to attach all kinds of legalese about communal usage rights and shared infrastructure. The tone wasn't quite threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. It was more like, we're giving you a chance to see things our way. Don't make us escalate. That nearly made me laugh. Who were these people? A bunch of neighbors who just moved in and decided they were all powerful because they formed a fancy-sounding association? I set the letters aside in a basket by the kitchen door, letting them pile up like junk mail. Sure, I read them, mostly out of morbid curiosity, but their demands had zero standing. They couldn't forcibly seize my farmland without a legal condemnation process, and that would require the county's involvement, plus court orders, plus who knows what else. The idea that the HOA had that kind of muscle seemed laughable. Still, I remember my father's advice. Don't let them corner you. So, I decided to do a bit of investigating of my own. Through an old friend who worked at the county clerk's office, I got wind that the Master Creek Estates group was indeed pushing for a special hearing. Something about amendments to local zoning that would accommodate a parking structure or paved overflow lot. My farmland was singled out as a candidate site. A candidate site, like it was just a vacant patch of weeds, not the place where I'd grown up busting my back in the fields. I try not to panic. I had resources. I had the original deed, my father's thorough records, and a direct lineage of ownership going back 130 years. That alone should have made it crystal clear who owned the land. Yet I'd learned long ago that bureaucracies can be twisted by whoever's got the loudest voice or the deepest pockets. Late one Friday evening, after a grueling day of hauling feed, I sat at my worn kitchen table, scanning old documents by the light of a single lamp. The old floorboards creaked in the quiet house. Outside, a gentle wind rattled the barn door. I kept reading the same line of an 80-year-old deed over and over, thinking about how precious this place was. Each generation fought tooth and nail to keep it running, to pass it down. We'd weathered storms, financial downturns, and personal tragedies. But we'd never been threatened by a property-hungry homeowners association. A sudden beep from my ancient phone made me jump. It was a text from another friend who lived on the outskirts of Master Creek Estates. He warned me that the HOA had sent out a mass newsletter boasting of a potential new parking solution, and how they expected it to be finalized soon. The arrogance. I felt anger claw on my chest again, but also a stubborn sense of mischief. They'd gone public with this idea before they even had it locked down. What if I turned the tables? I glanced toward the window, seeing a faint glow on the horizon, lights from the new development. Those lights existed because of the power lines running from my substation. A plan began to form in the back of my mind, one that made me grin in spite of my exhaustion. By the following morning, I made calls to the power company, reminding them of the old arrangement. My farmland houses the substation. I get certain concessions. As a courtesy, they'd keep me in the loop if any changes in power distribution were proposed. That meant I had advanced knowledge of how reliant Master Creek Estates was on that substation's capacity. Yet, before I got too deep into my scheming, something happened that gave me pause. I caught wind of a rumor that the HOA was planning an on-site inspection of my property. They called it an environmental assessment, but it sounded more like a scouting mission, probably to measure out their hypothetical car park. Enough was enough. That morning, I saddled up the old four-wheeler and drove out to the boundary line. The new road ended abruptly where my farmland began, separated by a battered wooden fence. I parked and hopped off, checking the fence posts. They'd seen better days, but they still stood. One by one, I hammered in new nails, replaced any broken slats, and added a shiny no trespassing sign for good measure. This was my land, and no glossy new HOA banner would change that. Just as I finished, a sleek SUV rolled up. Out stepped Richard March in the same ill-fitting suit, along with two equally overdressed women. They looked both shocked and annoyed to see me proactively guarding my fence. "We're here for the environmental assessment," Richard announced, adjusting his tie. "You can't block official business." I feigned ignorance. "Official business? My county contact says you're not authorized for any inspection on private property." He took out a clipboard. We filed the necessary paperwork. This farmland is being reviewed as part of a public use zoning ordinance. I let out a long breath, reminding myself not to lose my temper. "Until there's a court order allowing you to step foot on my property, you turn around." His face twitched with irritation, but he seemed momentarily unsure of his next move. Clearly, he expected me to be an uninformed pushover. Not today. We locked eyes, each challenging the other to back down first. There's an unspoken understanding between us. He had the fancy association behind him, and I had, well, the land and the electricity. Suddenly, one of Richard's associates chimed in. "We really should proceed, Richard. The timing here could be crucial." I nearly laughed at her choice of words. Timing, indeed. Sometimes, timing changes everything. Just like subscribing to this channel seems to bring good fortune to folks who do it at just the right moment. Funny how life works, huh? But anyway, back to what happened next. Before Richard could argue further, thunder rumbled in the distance. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, threatening rain. The weather forecast had called for a big storm, and it looked like it was coming in fast. As if on cue, the wind picked up, rattling the new no trespassing sign I'd just hammered in. Richard hesitated. I could practically see the debate in his eyes. Should he insist on crossing the fence right then, or retreat and come back another day? The women behind him clutched their clipboards, not looking keen on trudging through muddy farmland under a brewing storm. "You might want to head back," I suggested, slipping my hammer into my tool belt. "If you try to trespass now, you could get stuck in that old backfield. When it rains, the mud goes halfway to your knees." He pursed his lips. "We'll be back with official documents and county support. You can't stonewall us forever." I shrugged, keeping my tone polite, though inside I felt a righteous surge of satisfaction. "I'll be here, and so will my fence." They got into the SUV and drove off. The rain started not 10 minutes later, turning the whole landscape into a quagmire. I made it back to the house just in time to secure the shutters and watch the downpour from my porch. In the days that followed, I ramped up my plan. First, I dug into every piece of documentation about that substation: who maintained it, who paid for the electricity flowing through it, and how the lines were divided between the county, the power company, and Master Creek Estates. Turns out, the substation's location on my land gave me significant leverage. If the power company ever wanted to expand or modify those lines, they'd need my explicit permission. Not to mention, if an emergency forced a shutoff, I'd be the first to know. To be clear, I had no intention of actually cutting off power to an entire neighborhood. Least of all, because I have good folks living around here who need air conditioning, heat, and a working fridge. But the possibility alone made me realize how important my family farm was to the bigger puzzle. Maybe the HOA folks never considered that the quiet old farmland next door was, in fact, the lifeblood of their precious community infrastructure. Meanwhile, Master Creek Estates was going full throttle with their development. They had model homes, a tennis court, and a newly built clubhouse. Every time I drove past, I saw lines of vehicles parked haphazardly, half in the road, half on the curb. They definitely needed more parking space, especially if they were hosting events. But that wasn't my problem. On the Tuesday following the storm, I got an unexpected phone call from a man named Jacob Price, an elected county official who'd apparently been asked by the HOA to mediate. His tone was polite, more so than Richard's. He offered to sit down and discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. I agreed to meet him for coffee at the local diner. I arrived first, choosing a booth by the window, and Jacob came in soon after, a tall, lean man in his late 50s with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen more local politics than he cared to admit. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, sliding into the booth. "I'm hoping we can clear up some misunderstandings." "Sure thing," I replied, though my trust was cautious. "What does the HOA say?" He sighed, glancing at the menu. "They claim your farmland is zoned ambiguously, and they're pushing an ordinance that would allow them to pave a portion for overflow parking. They're prepared to compensate you, but maybe not at the level you'd want. And they say if you don't agree, they'll push for an eminent domain hearing." I folded my arms. "It's not ambiguous. My property deed is older than any of this new development. It's farmland, not public land. They can't just wave an ordinance around and seize it." Jacob nodded. "I agree it's not that simple. Eminent domain typically requires a clear public benefit, like a new road or a hospital. A parking lot for a private HOA might not cut it." "Might not," I repeated. He shrugged. "Sometimes these HOAs get cozy with certain committees. They spin it as a public necessity, like a public park, recreational space, or shared facility. They're trying to argue that the farmland is already underutilized and that you, as the owner, are blocking community growth. That's how they're packaging it." My jaw tightened. "And you? What do you think?" He looked thoughtful for a moment. "I think they're overreaching, but they have momentum. They have lawyers. And they can make your life miserable through legal hoops, even if they're ultimately in the wrong." I exhaled slowly, acknowledging the headache of a drawn-out legal battle. "Well, I'm not selling, and I won't let them bully me." Jacob raised his palms in a gesture of neutrality. "Understand. Look, I'm here because I believe we can find a compromise. Maybe you lease them a small portion of the land, some corner that isn't crucial to your farming, and let them develop a modest parking area. In return, they back off the rest of your property." I leaned forward, glancing at the diner's fluorescent lights reflecting on the table. "Compromise?" They rolled in here as if they owned the place. "They threatened me. You expect me to trust them?" He sighed. "I'm just telling you the reality of the situation. The county doesn't want a big legal fiasco, and the HOA is pressing hard." The waitress came by to refill our coffee cups. I stared out the window at the line of cars along the street, reminding me how many new residents had poured into the area. Growth was a double-edged sword. Good for local businesses, stressful for old-timers like me. "It's your decision," Jacob said gently. "But keep in mind, if you decide to fight them, do you have the means to go toe-to-toe in court?" I swallowed, thinking of my modest savings. Lawyers cost a fortune. My father had taught me to pick my battles wisely, but I also had a duty to protect the land he left me. Finally, I told Jacob I'd think it over. He nodded and paid for our coffees before heading out, presumably to report back to the HOA that I wasn't caving yet. As I watched him go, I felt torn. Maybe a small compromise would end this headache. Then again, every fiber of my being rebelled at the idea of letting a chunk of farmland become a parking lot. I decided I'd need some time to strategize. On my drive home, passing the orchard my mother once tended so lovingly, I knew one thing. If I had to stand up to the entire HOA, I would. I had something more than just stubborn pride on my side. I had that substation. And if push came to shove, I was prepared to remind them who truly controlled the power around here. A month later, the standoff reached a fever pitch. The HOA ramped up their narrative, holding community meetings where they plastered my name on slides with phrases like uncooperative landowner and standing in the way of growth. It was surreal seeing my face become the poster boy for obstruction. Some folks from Master Creek Estates, however, privately apologized to me in the grocery store, saying they didn't agree with the board's tactics. They just wanted a nice place to live, not a war over a parking lot. Meanwhile, I kept stockpiling information. Every letter, every snippet of the county code, every historical document proving my land's significance. I begun consulting with a lawyer friend, an old buddy who wasn't a big-shot attorney, but knew enough to guide me. He reminded me that the cost of litigation might be steep. Even if the HOA's case was weak, they could still drag it out. But I had a trump card, the substation. I wrote a formal letter to the County Power Authority, referencing the old contract my father signed decades ago. It clearly stated that any major changes to the farmland's designation, such as converting it to commercial or multi-use zoning, would require a renegotiation of the substation lease. In other words, if they changed my farmland to an HOA car park, the power company's lease wouldn't automatically continue. And that would put Master Creek Estates' entire power supply in jeopardy. The day I mailed that letter, I felt an odd mixture of anxiety and triumph. I was basically threatening to renegotiate an old power contract if the HOA forced my hand. Would the county call my bluff? Maybe. But it wasn't a bluff. If they took my land, I was under no obligation to keep that substation there on the same terms. Sure enough, less than a week later, I got an urgent request for a meeting. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the power company. Their representative was a calm, bespectacled gentleman named Mr. Harris. He explained that they'd been blindsided by the HOA's push, and they valued the existing arrangement with me. The substation was a crucial node for the entire area, and the cost of moving it would be astronomical. You have to understand, he said, taking off his glasses and wiping them with a cloth, relocating that substation would be a massive endeavor. Not to mention the downtime for thousands of residents. We're hoping to avoid that. I folded my arms. So am I. But the HOA is determined to pave my farmland. He nodded slowly. We've expressed our concerns to them. However, they seem confident they can win some type of condemnation hearing. If that happens, we fear the substation arrangement might be overridden or forced into a revised contract. That creates a whole new set of legal complications, ones we're not eager to face. I noticed the lines of stress on his forehead. This was a nightmare for the power company, too. They just wanted to keep the lights on, not get tangled in a property fight. So, what do you suggest? I asked, sipping from my cup of tea. Truthfully, we'd prefer if you could reach a peaceful resolution, he said. If you hold firm, though, we'll back you. Our arrangement predates Master Creek Estates. But we'd rather not see this go to court. It's messy and it's bad PR. I'm molded over. If the HOA drops this nonsense, I have no problem continuing the substation lease as it's always been. My father was proud to provide power for the county. We never wanted conflict. Mr. Harris offered a tight smile. I'll relay that. Perhaps we can help mediate a settlement. In the end, that's exactly what happened. The power company, realizing the HOA's plan could disrupt the substation's operation, put pressure on them to reconsider. Suddenly, Richard March and his cohorts weren't so cocksure. They were dealing with an entity bigger than a single landowner, the power grid. A county commissioner stepped in, calling a special meeting to address the dispute. I arrived early, armed with all my documents, prepared to fight tooth and nail. Richard was there too, flanked by a small army of suits. The commissioner began by reviewing the relevant laws, politely but firmly reminding the HOA that farmland, especially historically owned farmland, couldn't be taken lightly. Then the power company's representative spoke, highlighting the enormous risk and cost of relocating the substation if the land's use changed. Finally, I had my turn. I rose slowly, my heart pounding, but I steadied my voice as I addressed the room. I talked about my family's legacy, the significance of the farmland, and how proud I was that we'd helped supply electricity to the region for decades. "We're not the enemy here," I said. "I don't mind living alongside new neighbors, but I won't let anyone pave over my history or disrespect my rights." The commissioner asked the HOA if they had a counterargument. Richard stood, looking surprisingly subdued. He tried to spin the usual lines about public need, but the commissioner shut him down with a simple question: is it truly a public need if it only benefits a private HOA? That single line seemed to deflate their entire stance. By the end of the meeting, the commissioner made it clear that the county wouldn't support forcibly converting my farmland into a parking lot. He recommended the HOA find another solution, maybe a parking garage on their own property or a nearby vacant commercial lot. They had plenty of options if they'd just opened their eyes. And that was that. The moment it became evident the county wouldn't bend, and the power company wouldn't tolerate jeopardizing their substation, Richard's bravado fizzled. I suspect the legal threats were mostly bluffs anyway, an attempt at intimidation. With the county and the power grid aligned against them, they had no real leverage. After the meeting, a few HOA board members approached me in the hallway. They tried to be friendly, even apologetic. One woman mumbled something about miscommunication, while another claimed she was only following Richard's lead. Richard himself avoided me, skulking off to the parking lot as if I'd personally dunked him in the mud. I drove home that night with a sense of relief washing over me. The farmland was safe, the substation arrangement remained intact, and the HOA would be forced to look elsewhere for their precious parking. In the following weeks, they announced a new plan to partner with a local business complex for weekend overflow. It cost them more money, but at least they got their spaces. As for me, I got back to the rhythm of farm life, fixing fences, tending crops, and watching sunset from my porch in peace. Sure, I still see Master Creek Estates folks around town, but they don't bother me. Some of them even wave, probably relieve the drama is over. The moral of it all? Don't underestimate the quiet farmer with a century's worth of family history behind him, especially when he literally holds the key to your electricity. Sometimes power is more than just lines on a grid. It's knowing who you are, what you stand for, and not letting anyone trample on it. And that's how the HOA learned the hard way that my farm is no public HOA car park. It remains what it always was, my family's land, bursting with life, memories, and a legacy too stubborn to pave over.